Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 16 of It's So Easy and Otherwise by Duff McKagan. Chapter 16 is called The Fargin Bastydges. Here we go. With the legal framework overlaying our brotherhood, a sudden expansion of free time, and wallets, or rather boots, flush with cash, it was clear things were changing. One change I didn't see coming: heroin use in the band started to expand. Certain guys you just don't peg as the type to fall for the romantic image of the rock and roll junkie. Slash and I were really big drinkers, alcohol addicts if you will. Of course, if you are easily addicted to one thing, then chances are pretty good you'll be easily addicted to others. Bingo. Though he had dabbled a bit in the past, after we signed our deal and were all relatively flush with dough, Slash got himself strung out. And then, so did Steven Adler. He was smoking crack too. I think Stevie was willing to try anything that might dull the memories of his nightmarish childhood. Poor I knew I was an alcoholic and assumed I would address that problem at some unspecified point in the future. These were only shadowy thoughts, though, and I really had no plan as to how I would one day tackle it. Still, I was the most responsible guy in the band during this period. I drank every day, but I still drank mostly beer. I had also found this killer belt, a boxing championship belt decorated with Budweiser bottle caps. Like I was the heavyweight champion of beer. Since it was Bud, Axel started introducing me at shows as Duff, King of Beers, McKagan. Axel continued to drop out of sight for days on end as a result of his erratic moods. Sometimes it was as if he was on speed, bouncing off the walls. Then he would sleep for 3 days. When he was around, he was a bundle of energy. We're gonna do this and that, and oh yeah, let's write some lyrics. And we were like, yeah, we're gonna do those things, but we can't do them all at the same time. I was always aware of what a fundamentally different type of person Axel was from me. What a spectacle, I thought. What a figure. But we continued to get along great, and I loved his sense of conviction about the band. As 1986 wore on, Slash, Steven, and Izzy were in a constant cycle of cleaning up and going back out on the dope. It was hard to watch sometimes, but we were young, and they held it together for the most part for the sake of the band. Nothing was more important to any of us. Getting signed didn't earn us entry into some special fraternity of Hollywood elite or anything like that, though we did meet Nikki Sixx one night. Tom Zutaut, the guy who signed us to Geffen, had signed Motley Crue while at his previous job at Elektra. We went to Nikki's house and drank. At first we were like, whoa, it must be amazing to make enough money from music to have a house. Then we got really up. For us to start making any money, much less enough to buy a house, we needed to make an album. To make an album, we needed a producer. We wanted somebody who would capture us in the studio in a way that was true to our live ferocity. We made a mixtape for Tom to try to express how we wanted the recordings to sound. Motorhead, The Saints, Fear, Bon Scott-era AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, the Sex Pistols. Copies of the tape ended up circulating through Geffen's offices. But our search for the right person to produce us went nowhere. Part of the problem was that people didn't really know where to put us. We didn't fit comfortably into the sort of categories industry people dealt in. The knee-jerk inclination was to shoehorn us in with Whitesnake, Wasp, Autograph, Poison, Heshers, and Poodles. We didn't like the sound of those kinds of records. Most bands being signed at the time, Warrant, White Lion, Bullet Boys, all that, fit the bill. We were different. Poison wasn't playing alongside punk bands, that's for sure. And we didn't hang out with the types of people who formed bands like Bullet Boys. Like us, Jane's Addiction didn't fit in. But nothing shocking wouldn't be released until almost 2 years later. The guy who signed us really believed in us and tried to help us find the right producer, but we kept running up against the same attitude. Everyone wanted to take the edge off our music or to transform it into something they already understood. The first candidate came in and said Steven needed more rack toms and China cymbals. We had worked so hard to get Steven down to a small drum kit and get that groove going. Next up was Paul Stanley of Kiss, who wanted to produce our record too. He came out to see us play at Raj's, which was a grubby little place where a lot of underground bands played. We were surprised he showed up at such a dive, and we agreed to meet with him as a result. When he arrived at our rehearsal space to talk about his vision, he said he wanted to add double kick drums. Steven loved Kiss, absolutely loved them. And for a member of Kiss to suggest he revert to his teenage drum setup was something beyond his wildest dreams. Yeah, great idea. Izzy and I looked at each other, and we both had the same thought. This isn't going to work. We didn't tell Paul to his face that we didn't want him to produce us, but it was over from the word go, or rather the word double. For a time we thought we could get Mutt Lange, the producer behind AC/DC's Back in Black, but Mutt wanted $400,000 to walk into the room, plus a cut of the future earnings of the record. We had to pay for the studio and the producer out of our own $250,000 advance, and we had already taken out $75,000. We weren't going to borrow money to pay for a producer. With these pressures mounting and the band still recovering from the feuds over various aspects of the signing process, Geffen asked us to stop playing live. By then we were doing gigs nearly every week, and sometimes more often than that. Those regular appearances were a chance to, depending on your mental state, channel everything into your performance or block everything out. Just as important, the transcendent experience of playing our songs for an audience was a way to regularly refresh the brotherly bonds of rock and roll that held us together. Now, just when we needed that most, Geffen pulled the rug out from under us. The rationale? We had to build mystique by dropping out of sight, putting a premium on our performances. To say we didn't see eye to eye with this decision is an understatement. We agreed at first, though we had some gigs already booked that we honored. Soon, though, we had to figure out ways to play. We just functioned best when we could get on stage regularly, and we got bored. So we began to play a bunch of shows as the Fargin Bastydges to get around the label's injunction. We took the name from a scene in the movie Johnny Dangerously. It was an alias, not an alter ego. The set list and everything else was exactly the same as our normal Guns shows. It just allowed us to avoid fighting with Geffen. One of the shows we played was at Gazzari's, a venerable Hollywood dive we had always sort of wanted to play, just to say we had, but not the sort of place a band signed to a major label was supposed to play. But that was us. The industry had one set of priorities. We had our own. We picked up another Fender's gig at the end of July, playing as Guns N' Roses, that is, with Lords of the New Church, a punk supergroup featuring Stib Batters of the Dead Boys and Brian James of the Damned. In hindsight, we might have seen the seeds of later trouble being sown at this show. Axl turned up so late, we had to start without him. We played at the Whiskey again on August 23rd, a month after a Farewell to Hollywood show at the Troubadour. Still, it's hard to imagine the label people were too upset, because we debuted 2 new songs in concert that night, Sweet Child of Mine and Mr. Brownstone. We continued to take high-profile opening slots for national tours. I suppose Geffen saw those gigs as different from shows in a club milieu, as we were getting in front of new audiences. We played with Cheap Trick, Ted Nugent, and Alice Cooper. The night of the Alice Cooper gig, Axl showed up late again, and then was unable to get into the venue. Izzy and I sang. At the time, it was almost funny, though we were definitely pissed too, and we absolutely trashed the dressing room. We traded some words with Axl when we found him in the parking lot afterward, and at the end of the day, the situation lacked much in the way of consequences. We did the show, we got paid, and the crowd was there to see Alice anyway. That was that. For now. Probably the most memorable show of this sort took place on Halloween 1986. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, who were just starting their rise as a national act, and the Dickies were headlining a show at Ackerman Hall at UCLA, and we opened. We still had yet to enter the studio. We were feuding with Geffen about whether we had enough songs to warrant a recording, and we still hadn't found a producer we liked. We reached a compromise with the label to put out a limited edition bootleg EP live, Like a Suicide, and we had just finished it before this show. That night we felt like we were finally making some forward motion. The Dickies were still a big draw then, and aside from Social Distortion, pretty much the last band standing from the original wave of LA punk rock. For me, the cool thing about this show was that Black Flag's Henry Rollins watched our entire set from the wings of the stage and came up to us afterward and told us how much he liked our band. I considered him the most credible guy in rock, and he had a reputation as a guy who didn't mince words. He definitely wouldn't fawn over a band just for the sake of doing so. And we got the thumbs up. Kick ass. It turned out he had seen us once before. The year before, someone in Black Flag's crew had dragged him to some Hollywood club to see a couple glam bands. Apparently, we had opened the show. Rollins described the night in his journal, published years later, as art to choke hearts. The opening band was called Guns N' Roses, and they blew the headliners off so hard it was pathetic. And then we met Mike Klink. He had produced a couple of Triumph records. I hated Triumph. But Klink loved GNR and had seen us live a few times. He said he would come down and record us for nothing and convince us with his recording. When we got together, he said a cool thing about how the microphone picks up the sound and it goes to record onto a tape. It was his way of saying he didn't want to change us, couched in producer philosophy speak. He did a playback and said, "This is how I think your record should sound." And it was basically us live, and I immediately thought, that's exactly right. Well, that's the end of Chapter 16. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 16 in the comments below. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, Matt and Stacy from Canada. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.